Hello and welcome to the Continuum of Care CoC 101 training. This is a training series that will include multiple modules, and the goal is that each module will help you build a more advanced understanding of what the continuum of care is and what its role is in ending homelessness in your community. So my name is Jessica Stones. I'm with Diana T. Myers and Associates, and we're the consultant for the Western Pennsylvania Continuum of Care. And we are a consultant under contract with the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development, also known as DCED. And DCED is the collaborative applicant and CoC lead for the Western Pennsylvania Continuum of Care. So we're going to dive into Module 1, and hopefully you will join us for future modules as well. So we're going to walk through the background and history of the Continuum of Care program, a high-level overview to give you some context that will be helpful as we learn more about the CoC. Some very abbreviated history of the homeless housing system. So in the 1980s, emergency shelters were the key housing intervention for folks experiencing homelessness. But as you know, homelessness has persisted, and it was found that emergency shelter in and of itself is not the most effective intervention to end homelessness. You need a more advanced system that has different resources for different folks. So as a result, transitional housing emerged to help get folks ready for housing from shelter. Let's fast forward to 2009, 2010. We have the Hearth Act and opening doors. We're going to talk about both of these things. That really helped kind of transform the homeless response system. As a result of the Hearth Act and opening doors, which is the 10-year federal strategic plan, housing first became the standard, and housing was viewed as a tool to help achieve stability rather than housing being sort of the reward once someone achieves stability. And then in the 2010s, you'll see permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing interventions really taking the forefront among interventions for folks experiencing homelessness. Some of the key legislation from 1986, there was the Homeless Eligibility Clarification Act and the Homeless Housing Act. In 1987, there's legislation that you may be familiar with, which is the Stuart B. McKinney Homeless Assistance Act program. And this consisted of 15 programs that provided a range of services, and that legislation was renamed the McKinney-Vento Act in 2000. You may have heard that term. So the act originally consisted of 15 programs, which included services like emergency shelter, transitional housing, job training, primary health care, education, and some permanent housing. And the act contains 9 different titles, which each kind of address a different component of this range of services. The McKinney-Vento Act was then amended throughout the late 80s and early 90s. And then in 2009, the McKinney-Vento Act was reauthorized as the Homeless Emergency and Rapid Transition to Housing Act, also known as the Hearth Act, in May of 2009. So the Hearth Act really represented a paradigm shift for the homeless response system, where rather than just trying to manage homelessness, the goal was really to effectively end homelessness, using a holistic look at homeless services, understanding that HUD can only fund so much. You need to have a continuum of services that includes HUD, but also includes other services that folks may need. The Hearth Act had an emphasis on the CoC organizational structure and CoC planning. We'll get into the CoC structure and planning in a future module. There was a big focus on coordination and planning. HUD released their 10-year plan to end homelessness, which we'll talk about. The consolidated plan, which is the plan that communities create to kind of think about their housing and homelessness response system as a community. Emergency solutions, grant planning, all of these need to work together with the homeless response system, including other community plans that intersect with housing and homelessness services. And there was really an emphasis on outcomes and data, with an emphasis that all the programs in your community that are serving folks experiencing homelessness will be fully participating in HMIS, which is the database that is used by the homeless system to collect data about the folks who are served. Some other pieces of information about the Hearth Act: it revised the definition of homelessness, which we'll go over in a minute. The Emergency Shelter Program was revised and renamed the Emergency Solutions Grant Program, and we'll talk about what that program entails. The Hearth Act consolidated different homeless assistance programs into a more streamlined process, and it codified into law the CoC planning process, which we'll talk about later. So I noted that the definition of homelessness was updated through the Hearth Act. You may see these different categories referred to in your work, and let's just clarify what they each mean. So category 1 of homelessness is literally homeless, meaning someone is literally homeless on the streets in a place not meant for human habitation or an emergency shelter. Category 2 is someone's at imminent risk of homelessness, meaning they will be homeless within a certain amount of time unless an intervention is happening. Category 3 is homeless under other federal statutes. We'll talk in a minute about how different federal systems have different homeless definitions and how that intersects. And then category 4 is fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence. So within different programs, different categories of homelessness may be eligible. For example, in CoC funded housing programs, only category 1, literally homeless, and category 4, attempting to flee domestic violence or fleeing domestic violence, are eligible. I mentioned homeless under other federal statutes. The Department of Education, for example, has a different and more broad definition of homelessness. So that includes folks who are couch surfing and doubled up. So if you're a student experiencing a doubled up situation, you can get services within your school, for example. And the different definitions can be confusing, and it can create challenges for folks in accessing programs. It's important that folks working in the system are kind of educated about these different definitions to help folks navigate to the most appropriate resource. But in general, for CoC and ESG programs, folks who are at risk of homelessness, so they're not homeless yet, but are at imminent risk, are eligible for prevention resources, meaning a resource to help folks avoid entering the homeless system. Folks who are at imminent risk of homelessness can also be eligible for emergency shelter if they don't have any other resources. Now, folks who are literally homeless or fleeing domestic violence are often eligible for more permanent housing resources. So that includes CoC and ESG funded transitional housing, rapid rehousing, and permanent supportive housing. So let's talk a little bit more about this and what funding source funds which resources. So the Emergency Solutions Grant provides funding for street outreach, homeless prevention, emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, and HMIS. And again, HMIS is the database that's used by the homeless system. And you'll see when we move to continuum of care planning, there's some overlap in what ESG and CoC fund, but also some key differences. So CoC provides funding for CoC planning, coordinated entry, which is the system that's used to help folks at risk of homelessness or homeless navigate to the most appropriate resources. And we'll talk quite a bit more about coordinated entry in a future module. CoC funding can fund supportive services only projects, meaning they're programs that have just services and not housing. However, HUD has really moved away from funding that, and as of now, you can only fund renewals, meaning existing projects through CoC. HMIS, which I mentioned. Safe havens, which again is only for renewals. We don't have any more safe havens in the Western PA CoC. Those have kind of transitioned away over time. Transitional housing, and again, this is for renewals only. So existing transitional housing programs can continue getting CoC funding, but we can't go in for any new ones. Rapid rehousing. Joint component transitional housing, rapid rehousing is a newer intervention that HUD has been funding, and it basically combines transitional housing and rapid rehousing into one project, and then permanent supportive housing. So you'll see there's some overlap between what ESG and CoC can fund. So both can fund rapid rehousing, for example, but ESG is the only one that can fund shelters, and ESG is the only one that can fund homeless prevention. CoC, on the other hand, is really more focused about funding permanent housing interventions. So that includes things like rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. And the bulk of the CoC funding in the Western Pennsylvania CoC is for permanent supportive housing, followed by rapid rehousing. I mentioned the 10-year federal strategic plan to end homelessness, which is called Opening Doors. So that strategic plan laid out 4 key goals: preventing and ending homelessness among veterans by 2015, ending chronic homelessness by 2017, preventing and ending homelessness for families, youth, and children by 2020, and setting a path to end all types of homelessness. So as you can imagine, there's still a lot of work to do around these goals, and we do anticipate a new federal strategic plan coming out in the near future. One concept from the Opening Doors federal strategic plan that's important for you to be familiar with is called functional zero. And basically what functional zero is effectively ending homelessness, not by saying we're never going to have folks who are homeless again, but by creating a system that has enough capacity and resources to not only prevent homelessness when possible, but if folks do become homeless, immediately permanently housing them, both now and in the future. So you're building that system capacity, and your system has enough capacity to address homelessness for anyone who may become homeless. So the Western PA CoC actually did have an effective end to veterans homelessness. So in the summer of 2019, the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness approved a declaration from the Western PA CoC that the CoC had effectively ended veterans homelessness. And the CoC knows that we'll continue to see veterans in the community who are experiencing homelessness, but what this declaration means is that the community has come together to build a system that quickly identifies veterans experiencing homelessness and assists those veterans in being housed as quickly as possible, and there's sufficient resources to identify and house any veteran experiencing homelessness within the CoC's 20-county region. You may see the term HUD SNAPS come up. SNAP stands for the Office of Special Needs Assistance Program, and that's the HUD office where the CoC program falls. So some of the policy priorities of the HUD SNAPS office are, again, ending homelessness for all persons, creating a systemic response to homelessness, strategically allocating and using resources, and using a housing first approach. So what is a housing first approach? Housing first is built on the premise that homelessness is a housing crisis, and it can be solved through providing housing, both safe and affordable housing. And that all people experiencing homelessness, regardless of their history of homelessness, their duration of homelessness, whatever kind of factors and challenges they bring with them, all people can achieve housing stability and permanent housing. And it kind of does away with this concept of housing readiness and says everyone is housing ready who's experiencing homelessness. Oftentimes, folks, once they achieve housing, can work on improvements in other areas of life, such as health, mental health, substance abuse, and employment. But housing has to be that first foundation. And sobriety, compliance, and treatment, or even a clean criminal history is not a necessity to succeed in housing. So housing should not be built on, you must achieve sobriety before you can attain housing, for example. Housing first kind of does away with that concept. It also believes that people experiencing homelessness have the right to choice, to self-determination, and should be treated with dignity and respect. And then the exact configuration of your housing and services really should be dependent upon the specific person and should be tailored to their needs. It's not a one size fits all. And it's not housing only, meaning we provide you housing and good luck. It's really housing as the foundation and providing whatever services someone needs to be successful. So HUD has outlined certain components that they believe are crucial for an effective homeless crisis response system. First is that systems are following a low barrier housing first approach, which we just talked about. That systems are housing focused, meaning folks may come with a variety of different needs, but housing really needs to be the main driver of what you're working on with someone. And once someone is housed, they often have capacity to work on other areas. The effective crisis response system promotes flow through the system, meaning you have enough of different types of resources to be able to help folks quickly achieve permanent housing. You don't want folks to kind of get stuck in emergency shelter because they can't, there's not enough resources to go around. That's just an example. It also believes that people should be diverted from homelessness whenever possible, meaning that you're trying to explore any other options that someone may have outside of the homeless system. And then it prioritizes the most expensive and intensive interventions for those with the most severe service needs and longest histories of homelessness. So permanent supportive housing, for example, is a pretty intensive intervention that's long-term, and that should really be reserved for folks who need that level of services to be successful. The next two slides will just kind of give you a snapshot of what homelessness looks like in Western PA CoC with some data. So the point in time count is a snapshot of a single point in time, one night in January, of homelessness in the CoC. The point in time count does have limitations in understanding the full picture. Again, it's only one night. As you probably know, homelessness is often hidden and you may not count everyone who's experiencing homelessness on that night. However, HUD requires the point in time count, and this is a way of tracking homelessness year over year with a fairly consistent methodology. So you'll see in this chart, in 2016, there were 986 folks identified during the PIT count as experiencing homelessness. In green, you'll see the folks in shelter, gray, safe haven, and again, we've kind of moved away from safe havens. Blue is transitional housing, and then yellow is unsheltered. And then in 2020, there were 754 households, or persons, sorry, experiencing homelessness. So you'll see the numbers have been going down. The CoC did set an aggressive goal in the strategic plan of 553 persons by 2020 and 490 by 2021. And though we haven't achieved that goal, there has been a steady decline since 2016. Another way of kind of assessing what homelessness looks like in the Western PA CoC is looking at households who are accessing coordinated entry. And again, we'll talk more about coordinated entry in a later session. So these are households who are seeking services due to housing instability or homelessness. And they may not necessarily be homeless yet, but they are seeking resources. So as you can see, the number of folks who were assessed by the coordinated entry system in 2019 was almost 3,000 people. And 36% of those households were families and 64% were singles and couples. Understanding the true picture of homelessness is complex, as there's not like one single way of measuring it, but we think this data provides important context. And the last thing we're going to just hit on is these key terms. There are a lot of acronyms that get thrown around in the homeless system, so we hope this will provide you a little cheat sheet. So I'll just touch on a few of these, not all of them, but if you hear the term BNL, that's the by name list. That's a term used in coordinated entry for all the folks who have been assessed through the system and are experiencing homelessness and are awaiting a housing resource. DCED, I mentioned earlier, is the Department of Community and Economic Development. That is the collaborative applicant and CoC lead for the Western Pennsylvania CoC. We have ESG, which is the Emergency Solutions Grant Program. HUD, which is the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. That's the federal department that oversees homeless services. NOFA is a term you may hear, which stands for Notice of Funding Available. That's a term HUD uses a lot when they put out new grant funds. PA 601, this is the HUD code for the Western Pennsylvania CoC. So sometimes you may hear of the CoC referred to as PA 601. PIT is the point in time count. RHAB, RHAB is the Regional Homeless Advisory Board. We'll talk about this later, but these are entities within the community who really help drive the homeless strategy for the community. And then the VI-SPDAT is the Vulnerability Index Service Prioritization and Decision Assistance Tool, which is a mouthful, but you may hear this term. This is the tool used by the coordinated entry system to help assess folks for homeless resources. So that's the end of module 1. Hopefully we'll see you for future modules.